Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's so great to be here with you all. Perfect. Although I have to say, after listening to some of your presentation, I'm about to get rid of my smartphone and my iWatch and just sort of disconnect altogether.
True. So we have, everyone here has a million questions about the I word, information warfare. And so I wanted to, it's a very broad issue. Lots of different pieces to it. I know you've been very involved in the discussion kind of around that. But the first thing I wanted to talk about is deepfakes. I know that's an issue that you've been involved in a lot. And I'm sure everyone here knows what deepfakes are, but just in case you don't, it's images, video that have been manipulated using artificial intelligence to depict people doing or saying things that they haven't done or said. So I know you have, your background is in the national security world. Just kind of curious, how do you see this, what exactly is the threat here posed by deepfakes? How have you seen it change over the years?
Well, deepfakes to me is just a new tactic in an age-old misinformation war. And I used to work at the Department of Defense. In OSD policy, but also involved in writing some of the strategic guidance as it related to how we write war plans. And at that time, we would break out war into phases. And phase 0 was something fairly new that we had bolted onto war plans, where it was the shaping of the environment, all the stuff that happens prior to kinetic. And that was where the information warfare stuff would happen. But the reality is that that's really evolved. And war is less in these segments that we use to plan out, to write our war plans, and more on a continuum. And I think we're seeing now that our adversaries engage in this information warfare almost as an ends to a means, as opposed to a setup for actually some sort of kinetic action. If they are successful in the information warfare, then they never have to get to kinetic. And given that we have such significant overmatch when it comes to the traditional means of warfare, it's in their best interest in many cases to be successful in this information warfare effort. And so what that means is that war has changed, and the combatants have changed. So if you think of kinetic war, it's usually soldiers on some sort of front line. But in an information war, it is every single person who has access, who has a cell phone or access to the internet or otherwise. And so now you have people who are not traditionally in the mindset of war or realize that they find themselves on the battlefield involved in this process. And deepfakes is just another tactic to fool or change an opinion of those people who are on these front lines of the battlefield. And so I think our tactics as the U.S. government and as people involved in national security have to change, acknowledging that the parameters of what we consider to be conflict have changed.
Oh, for sure. So there's a lot to pick apart there. Yeah. But I know you've recently introduced 2 pieces of legislation kind of helping us wrap our heads around this threat. One of them focusing on the Homeland Security Department reporting on this issue, another on the intelligence community kind of further studying it. What don't we understand about the threat right now, and how would those bills kind of push our understanding forward?
Well, I think there's a lot that we either don't understand or haven't yet thought through the implications and the impact. And let me just take a step back and say that prior to the 2 initiatives that you mentioned that I've worked on this Congress, in the last Congress, I introduced some language into the Intel Authorization Act that would require the DNI to conduct a study that did a risk assessment as well as our capabilities to respond assessment. And for political reasons, even though it was a bipartisan bill, it wasn't advanced. And so the folks that I was working on that with, converted it into a letter to the DNI asking them to provide us this information. They responded, but they responded with a classified report. So I have a little bit of that information. I can't talk a lot about that. But it was really the opening salvo, in my opinion, of trying to get to the bottom of what we know and what we don't know as it relates to the use of deepfakes, both by, in that case, it was by our foreign adversaries, and from an intel perspective. This Congress, we've moved forward. I was grateful to see Adam Schiff in June of this year hold a hearing on deepfakes to help us understand better what we do know and what we don't know. And then the two pieces of legislation that you're referencing, one does request that the intel community, it's in the Intel Authorization Act this year, requests that the intel community provide an unclassified assessment. And again, as I mentioned, I think in an information warfare where your average civilian is on the front lines, the way you counter misinformation and disinformation is by providing greater transparency and accurate information as the U.S. government. So I think it's important that we have an unclass assessment of this threat and how we're organized to respond to it. The other piece of legislation is called the Deepfakes Report Act, and that one directs the Department of Homeland Security, and it's put together in conjunction with Democrats and Republicans, Democrat Kilmer, and then two Republicans, King and Hurd. It's already passed the Senate, and it basically asks DHS's Undersecretary of Science and Tech to do an assessment of deepfakes as it relates to our homeland security and how we're organized and what technologies we have to respond. And I know that in the national security world, and I know at least when I was at the Pentagon, it was always, another report. But I do think in an emerging technology and an emerging tactic like this, it's important for us to start with a report, to start with wrapping our arms around what our adversaries are capable of and what technologies and capabilities we have so that we can then use that information to determine what laws need to be in place, what investments need to happen, and what maybe organizational, structural changes need to be made to address this threat. I think sometimes we respond to a threat without fully understanding it. And so we're starting with reports here so that we can have more meaningful and more targeted legislation to follow on.
For sure. So these reports come out. What would you expect to see in them, based on what you know now?
Well, I would expect to see that our adversaries are very soon going to have the ability to make videos, fake videos, appear seamless. My hope is that we have technology that can identify deepfakes. And so once you set the technology aside, then comes the questions around what's legal, who's responsible when there are deepfakes out there, what is the role of a platform for providing transparency or pulling things down? Does that violate our First Amendment rights, censorship? It's going to open up a pretty big conversation, but it's a conversation that's had in parallel with quite a number of other things that are going on right now in this information warfare. And, I think one of the big things, too, is where's the corporate patriotism in this? What's the corporate responsibility for getting shoulder to shoulder with government to help address this threat that could be quite disruptive in a democracy like ours?
Oh, for sure. Well, I definitely want to dig into that at some point. But last kind of thing on this is you hear about deep fakes and misinformation more generally a lot in the context of election interference. The political process trying to sway opinion of different politicians and that kind of thing. Is there an appreciation for some of the other potential impacts that deepfakes could have? I know people also have discussed, their ability to sway markets, that kind of thing. If you have a CEO saying something, and that could influence the stock price.
Deepfakes has the ability to sow quite a bit of discord all across our society, whether it's in elections, and I'm particularly sensitive to that because I represent a district in Orlando, so the swing part of the swing state. Florida has been the state that has had some issues and played maybe a more prominent role than we've wanted to in recent elections. And definitely has been a target of outside interference. But it also has the ability to, as you said, move markets, or a group that is pretty spun up about this are Hollywood actors, so famous people. They have been the target of these deep fakes that really starts to affect their brand. But it also, in that industry, there are two sides to that. There are the use of computer-generated images is allowing the entertainment industry in a legitimate way to do some interesting, creative movies. So, the new Lion King, they use some of the same technologies that might also be used to show an actress doing something that she wouldn't be doing. And so it poses really interesting questions within all sectors, whether that's elections or entertainment or our economy, as to what is acceptable, what isn't, and who gets to decide that.
Absolutely. I think I read an article the other day. It was I think it was the MIT Technology Review, but it was saying like 96% of the deepfakes that have been out there have been used for some kind of personal harassment, which I found it to be not a big part of the conversation out here as much. But so kind of getting at this, what is Congress's role in doing this? So you have these reports come out, you kind of wrap your head around the issue. How would you want Congress to move forward with this? Is it a matter of putting in some kind of regulation on the tech platforms? What should we expect to see?
I don't think there is one single action. As I mentioned, deepfakes is one tactic in this disinformation, misinformation, or information war. And so we are all grappling with the questions of who has responsibility for what. And I think you can break it out into the technology piece. So government has the responsibility of appropriating funds so that our defense and homeland security agencies have the resources they need to develop technology to identify and counter. And then you have the pieces of the questions that are still unanswered a bit in the, what responsibility do corporations have in helping provide transparency? So is it just that they need to tag anything that has been altered? And do they have the technology to identify that this has been altered? Or do they have a responsibility for taking down content that they know is incorrect and may have a destabilizing effect? Where are those bounds? What are those guidelines? And I think whether it's deepfake or ads that don't meet the level of truthiness, let's say, we are trying to identify what those lines are right now. And so deepfakes is just part of a broader conversation of how we handle what laws need to be in place, who has what responsibility in this information warfare.
For sure. I'd love to get your thoughts on some of the things that corporations have said they'd be doing, their kind of conversation around this issue. I know Mark Zuckerberg a few weeks ago said, Facebook is not going to be taking down political ads that don't meet that level of truthiness. Do you see them making a good faith effort right now in combating this issue?
So I am chair of what's called Future Forum. We're 50 of the youngest members of the Democratic caucus, and we focus on issues that matter to the next generation of Americans. And I also think we have a role in this Congress of focusing on issues that maybe we're more well-equipped as digital natives and digitally conversant members. to address. And so one of the areas we've looked into is, say, data privacy, but we also had Facebook recently to speak with Future Forum about what they're doing to secure our next elections, to be partners with us in this. And while I think what they shared with us shows that they're making steps in the right direction, certainly there may be more that can be done. Their current focus right now is on authenticity. So they aren't trying to decide what is acceptable messaging or unacceptable messaging, or what's true or what isn't true. They're really trying to go after people who are misrepresenting themselves. So if you are an entity in Russia and you're actually a part of the GRU or something like that, and you set up an account saying that you are Floridian, that violates this authenticity standard that they have, and so they've been moving to shut down those entities. Mm-hmm. They claim that they are finding some success in minimizing the disinformation by going after the authenticity piece of somebody's identity online. But I think this is a conversation that needs to continue to be had, and there needs to be more that can be done. Because certainly in China, they hold the platforms and the websites responsible for information that's on it. And I'm not saying that we should apply China's autocratic approach to technology, but somewhere between these two options of we have no responsibility and you accept total responsibility and are an arm of the state in our efforts to, suppress speech. Somewhere in the middle is the right answer, I think, for a democracy as vibrant as ours.
For sure. So what's the role of the government in kind of facilitating that kind of more proactive approach by Facebook and some of these other platforms? Like, I know there's been a big push recently to kind of increase information sharing around some of these threats with the private sector and even within the government. Where do you see that process right now, and where would you want to see it go in the years ahead?
I always say that members of Congress have three levers for dealing with any particular issue. We have the ability to legislate, obviously, and that is, writing laws. But I always believe that because once you pass something into law, it takes a law to change that. And just look at any of the editing mistakes of the tax plan. You see how difficult that is. So you want to be really careful about passing something into law that may have unintended consequences. So the ability to legislate, we have oversight capabilities. So oversight of the administration, the executive branch, in the way that they are implementing strategies using the funds appropriated by Congress to address these threats. And then finally, and also oversight on industry, right? And finally, we have a messaging platform. And that's the power of being able to convene people to have conversations, to understand an issue better, and then from that, maybe do better hone your legislative and oversight capabilities. And I think we're going to have to use a little bit of all of that. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing some of that happen already. Hearings, trying to better understand this issue, trying to shed some light on it and help your average consumer or your average user of the cyberspace be able to understand what's going on. And then we'll need to carefully legislate and appropriate resources to address these issues, especially as it relates to our national security and defending our democracy.
Do you think Congress has that kind of technical know-how right now to be able to do that? I know that's probably a question you get a lot, but
yeah. Well, I carefully tried to be diplomatic about saying Future Forum's ability to, as members who are a little more digitally conversant, digital natives, our ability to step into this place. I think, there are a number of members who either have that background, who are capable of doing it. I know that some of the hearings, especially over in the upper chamber, haven't inspired a ton of confidence that you have members occupying, Congress that have the capability of comprehending this space. But I think there certainly are a number of members who do, and the onus is on us to better understand the space and move out. And I think that's why Future Forum, we try to provide a lot of content to our members around the space that they're uniquely qualified to legislate or provide oversight on.
For sure. So I have a couple more questions, but I wanted to have a little time at the end to open it up to the audience. So if anyone out there has a couple questions, get them ready. So with this, I mean, deepfakes, misinformation more generally, a lot of this is being propagated by nation-state adversaries, Russia, China, potentially Iran. Are we doing enough as a government to deter this behavior? I know, people talk about using all of the levers of power, persistent engagement by, groups like Cyber Command, sanctions, but it's still happening. Is there something more that we need to be doing to deter this?
Yeah, I think the deterrence piece is a place where we've fallen a bit short. And I'll take just, for example, Russia's interference in our 2016 election. All of our intel community is in agreement that this happened, right? So Russia interfered in our 2016 election, and yet there have not been any consequences. And we have proposed sanctions. I lead the Blue Dogs, which is a coalition of Democrats united behind fiscal responsibility and a strong national security. And we rolled out an election security package that had some pretty robust sanctions as a way to punish bad actors. And none of that stuff has been voted on or adopted. And I heard the commander of Cyber Command recently say that in the 2020 election, expect a wide number of actors to attempt to sow discord in our 2020 election. And why wouldn't they? Russia suffered zero consequences for that, their interference. And they, on the whole, got what they wanted, which was to undermine our democracy, to sow discord within our society. So I think it's really important that we punish people who attempt to, attack our systems. I think to give some credit, though, in the 2018 elections, there were efforts to take down troll farms, and there were some publicly acknowledged efforts on behalf of the government to prevent some of that interference. And I think that's a step in the right direction, but certainly we have to be more assertive about this.
Do you think we're better positioned for 2020 than we were in 2018, 2016?
Better position only in that we are a little more aware. And I believe that departments and agencies, despite the public debate of the political folks, the hardworking men and women who are in our departments and agencies are working hard to try to counter this threat. I believe that. But I think there need to be more resources. I think there need to be a greater integration of a whole of government effort. And again, taking, for example, election security. Two counties in Florida were hacked by the Russians. The notification process was somewhat convoluted. Took 2 years after the fact for a member of Congress for a delegation to be briefed on this issue. The people who were affected, our voters in Florida, still don't know which ones, and we're hiding behind old mentality of warfare, which is protect the citizenry by not telling them anything, by overclassifying. But the reality in this situation is that we have to have transparency to combat the kind of uncertainty that's sown by Floridians knowing that somebody might have had their voter registration messed with, but not being able to go verify for themselves. And so I have a bill called the Alerts Act that does require timely notification. It is on the same premise that when you are hacked by your credit card company or your social media account is hacked, you are notified, because at the end of the day, you are the victim. The way we still look at it, or the way the Department of Justice and the FBI still looks at it, they look at it as the state offices of elections are the victims, not the voters. And I think that's wrong. We've got to change that mindset.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have time for one or two audience questions. I know this guy over here had his hand up.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very concise and comprehensive commentary on this very difficult problem. I'm from the National Intelligence University, and one of the courses I teach is called Foreign, Cyber, and Information Strategies. So what would you like us have impart to the future leaders and managers of the intelligence community in our courses?
In your courses. Well, I love that you are teaching that course, and I imagine that maybe a couple decades ago, the same course was taught with, no? Well, I mean, disinformation has been one of these key tactics in warfare for all time. I think for us, it's a multi-piece. So you have to be able to teach all of the different ways that foreign adversaries attack us. But I think just as important is how we create not just a whole of government, but a whole of society response to this. How do we adopt models that have been used in some other countries, smaller populations, but on the front edge of Russian interference, how they have inoculated or at least created an awareness in their citizenry that this is a threat. From the time children are small, they understand the need to discern fact from fiction. And then what tools can we give your average citizen to be well-equipped on the front lines of this battlefield?
Awesome. I think we have time for one more. Go over here. Or either way.
Yeah? All right. Thank you. Senator Moynihan said everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not entitled to their own facts. Do you think that there's any potential for Congress to actually institute laws governing the veracity of claims made in the public domain, particularly when they're made by prominent officials and U.S. government leadership? In the run-up to the war in Iraq, of course, there were false claims made about connections between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, for instance, by officials that led to effectively mass deception among the American people. We also have a regular Twitter user who issues demonstrably false claims into the public domain, and that is certainly a part of our politics.
Yeah. I think it's really hard to have somebody who can be, to borrow a previous Republican president's term, who I think a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for him now, a decider of truth, right? When especially since we have such strong First Amendment protections. So instead of having a decider of truth to identify falsity, or verify veracity, maybe what we should have is greater transparency and let the folks suffer the consequences for spewing lies. So greater transparency on who is saying what. So obviously with the Twitter account, that's one thing, but in our political ads that you see, who's serving you those ads? Is it your fellow American who wants to have an honest debate about issues that matter to you and will matter in this coming election? Or is it an outside government using dark money to put up falsehoods? I mean, I think that's why, when they make us, when we put up ads, say, paid for by, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, or a campaign for Stephanie Murphy, it's to own your what you say, what you put out into the world, so that if you are lying, that is up to the voters and the discerning public to punish you for being a liar, to judge you for not being truthful. And I think that's probably the first step in the least controversial way to address this issue without somehow infringing on somebody's First Amendment right. You can say what you want, whether it's true or not true, but own it.
For sure. Well, that's pretty much all the time we have. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.